Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty dark. We're going to tackle the Jack the Ripper case.
Yeah, a classic.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, it's one of those stories that I feel like just about everybody has at least heard of,
Yeah.
and it's fascinating how even over 100 years later, it still has this hold on us, you know?
Absolutely.
So you sent over this really in-depth Wikipedia article on Jack the Ripper, and it's got just a ton of information.
Yeah, it's pretty thorough.
Yeah, it is. So our goal today is going to be to kind of like go through this article, pull out the key details of these horrific murders, try to get a sense of what life was really like in Whitechapel back then, and talk about why this mystery continues to captivate us, all these years later.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really fascinating to sort of peel back the layers of history, the folklore, and even the sort of pseudo-history that's grown up around the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, right at the heart of this whole chilling story, you have these five women who have become known as the canonical five. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. All of them, living and struggling in this incredibly harsh and overcrowded part of London.
Yeah, it's hard to even imagine what life must have been like in Whitechapel at that time. I mean, just the sheer density of people. The article mentions there were something like 80,000 people crammed into that district.
80,000.
Yeah, which, by today's standards, that's not a huge number. But for the late 19th century and in such a small area, that's an incredible concentration of people.
Absolutely. And these five murders that happened between August and November of 1888, they're the ones that are most consistently linked to this mysterious figure we call Jack the Ripper. But it is interesting to remember that back then he was also known by some other pretty unsettling names too, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The Whitechapel murder was a pretty common one, and even in the early days of the investigation, there was all this talk of someone called Leather Apron.
Leather Apron, yeah. It almost sounds like a character straight out of a horror story, doesn't it?
It does, and it really gives you a sense of how the fear and all these theories were kind of evolving in real time as these murders were happening.
Absolutely. And what really seems to have just terrified Londoners at the time was the sheer brutality of these attacks.
Hmm.
You know, each of these women, their throats were slashed, these deep cuts, and then there were these really extensive abdominal mutilations. In at least three of the cases, their internal organs were removed.
Right, and that really fueled all this speculation about whether the killer had some kind of anatomical knowledge, like maybe he was a butcher or a surgeon or something. And honestly, it makes you wonder what kind of person could even do something like that.
Chilling stuff. And then there's, of course, the name itself, Jack the Ripper. That comes from the Dear Boss letter, which was one of several letters that were sent to the press and to Scotland Yard, all claiming to be from the murderer.
Yeah. And what's really interesting about that Dear Boss letter is that it's actually the very first time that name appears. But the article makes it pretty clear that there's a lot of doubt about whether it was really written by the killer or not.
Right, right. I mean, it could have just been, what, like a really sick joke or something?
It could have been. A lot of people think that it and a lot of the other letters that came later were probably hoaxes, maybe even written by journalists trying to drum up even more attention for the story and sell more papers.
Yeah, I mean, you can just imagine the frenzy that something like that would cause. And then you've got the even more disturbing From Hell letter, which was sent to George Lusk, who was part of this group called this Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. That one was really messed up because it actually came with half of a preserved human kidney.
Ugh, that's just gruesome. And the letter claimed that that kidney was taken from one of the victims.
I mean, talk about just driving home the horrific reality of what was happening.
Right. It just really brings home the brutality of these crimes
Yeah.
and the kind of impact they had on people. And really, I think it's through this really intense media coverage that the public really started to latch onto this idea of a single terrifying figure, Jack the Ripper.
And the article is really interesting in how it points out how important that sensational media coverage was in building this whole enduring legend, giving it this international notoriety that still exists to this day. It wasn't just a local London horror story. It really captured the world's imagination.
It is fear.
And fear, yeah.
Absolutely. It really became this global phenomenon. And while the police, they were investigating all these murders in Whitechapel and Spitalfields, 11 of them in total, between 1888 and 1891, they were never able to definitively connect all of those to the canonical five. So, we're left with this really potent mix of historical facts, these incredibly chilling stories, and as the article calls it, pseudo-history, and of course, the fact that the case remains unsolved. And I think that's a huge part of why it continues to fascinate us.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, so let's dig in a little bit to the world where all of this was happening. What was Whitechapel actually like back in 1888? I mean, the article paints a pretty bleak picture.
It does. It was, to put it mildly, not a pleasant place to live. It was incredibly overcrowded, poverty was rampant, and there was just this general sense of desperation and lawlessness. To even begin to understand the vulnerability of the women who were targeted, you really have to look at this broader social context.
Okay, so walk me through that. What were some of the key factors that were at play?
Well, for one thing, you had this huge influx of immigrants coming into the East End during the mid 19th century, a lot of Irish immigrants. And then starting in the 1880s, you had all these Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. And they were all kind of settling in the same
And
areas.
that led to some pretty extreme overcrowding, right?
It did. I mean, you think about 80,000 people packed into this relatively small area. And with that kind of density comes, really terrible living conditions, inadequate housing, very few job opportunities. A lot of people ended up living in what we would consider just, abject poverty.
Yeah. The article mentions this statistic that I think it was over half of the children born in the East End died before they even reached the age of 5.
55%, yeah. Which is just, it's heartbreaking.
That's just unimaginable.
It's a staggering statistic. It really just highlights the level of desperation and hardship that people were facing.
Yeah, it really puts things into perspective. And it wasn't just the poverty, right? There were all these other social problems that were intertwined with it.
Oh, absolutely. Robbery and violence were, everyday occurrences. Alcoholism was a huge problem. And for a lot of women, prostitution was really the only way they could survive. The article estimates there were about 1,200 prostitutes and 62 brothels operating in Whitechapel at the time.
Wow. So you've got this population that's already incredibly vulnerable, and then you add this element of danger and exploitation. It's almost like a recipe for tragedy.
It is. It's a perfect storm of vulnerability. And then, of course, you have the housing situation. A lot of people couldn't even afford to rent a room, so they ended up in these places called common lodging houses.
Yeah. Tell me about those.
They were essentially flop houses. They were really cheap, but the conditions were just appalling. They were incredibly overcrowded, filthy, and there was very little in the way of security or privacy. I mean, for 4 pence, you could get what they called a coffin bed, which was basically just a tiny cramped space. And if you couldn't even afford that, you could sleep on a rope stretched across the dormitory for just 2 pence.
Wow. I mean, it's hard to even imagine living in a place like that.
It must have been absolutely miserable. And you can imagine how easy it would be for someone to just disappear in a place like that. No one would even notice they were gone.
Right. It's almost like the perfect hunting ground for a predator.
It was. And then on top of all of that, you have this backdrop of social unrest and, just general anxieties about crime, about immigration, about these changing social dynamics.
The article mentions that there were quite a few demonstrations and even riots happening in Whitechapel around that time.
Yeah. It was a really volatile time. You had all this tension building up, and it was just, kind of waiting for a spark to ignite it. And unfortunately, I think that spark ended up being the Ripper murders.
Okay, so let's talk about the murders themselves. The article really makes a point of distinguishing between the canonical 5 and all these other killings that were happening in and around Whitechapel at that time. What's the significance of making that distinction? Why is that so important?
Well, the big thing to keep in mind is that there's actually no definitive proof that all of the murders of women during this period were committed by the same person. Police, they were investigating this whole cluster of killings that became known as the Whitechapel murders, and that actually included 11 separate murders that happened between April 1888 and February 1891.
So the canonical 5 are just a subset of those.
Right. They're the 5 murders that most experts agree are the most likely to be the work of the Ripper, based on the specific modus operandi, the way they were carried out.
Okay, so what makes the canonical 5 so unique? What sets them apart from the other murders?
The big things are the really deep slash wounds to the throat, the extensive abdominal and genital mutilations, the removal of internal organs in some cases, and this kind of pattern of progressive facial mutilations. Those are the hallmarks of what we think of as the Ripper's crimes.
So those specific details are really what lead people to believe that they were all committed by the same person.
Exactly. And the article talks about these 2 early cases, those of Emma Elizabeth Smith and Martha Tabram, and it explains why those are generally not included in the canonical 5. Do you want to go into that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, from what I remember from the article, Emma Elizabeth Smith was actually attacked pretty early on in April of 1888. And she was robbed. She was sexually assaulted. and she was really badly injured. But the way she was attacked seems pretty different from the later Ripper murders.
Right. She definitely suffered a really brutal attack, but the wounds weren't consistent with the Ripper's MO. She wasn't subjected to that really characteristic deep throat slashing, and there wasn't the same level of abdominal mutilation.
So it's more likely that her attack was just part of this, this broader problem of violence and crime that was happening in Whitechapel at the time.
That's what most experts believe. It's possible that it was a separate incident of, maybe gang violence or something like that.
Okay. And what about Martha Tabram? Her murder was also just incredibly violent, wasn't it?
It was. She was killed in August of 1888, and she was stabbed 39 times. 39 times.
39 times. That's
It's
just...
terrific, but the thing is, she also didn't have the deep throat slashes or the abdominal mutilations that became so associated with the Ripper. So while the police initially thought that her case might be connected, a lot of modern researchers don't think she was a Ripper victim because of those differences in the way she was killed.
Okay, so the canonical five really stand out because of this very specific and gruesome way in which they were killed. Let's go through the details of each of those five murders, starting with Marianne Nichols. Can you tell me what happened to her?
So Marianne Nichols she was the first of the canonical five. She was discovered in Bucks Row really early in the morning on August 31st, 1888. Her throat had been slashed, two deep cuts, one of them so deep that it reached her vertebrae. And she had also been stabbed in the vagina, and her lower abdomen was partly ripped open with her bowels protruding. And there were some other, downward thrusting incisions on her abdomen as well.
It's just awful.
It's a truly horrific scene. And, the discovery of her body really just sent shockwaves through Whitechapel. And as we'll see, the murders that followed just continued to escalate in their brutality.
Okay, so then just over a week later, you have the murder of Annie Chapman.
Right. Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of a house on Hanbury Street on September 8th. And again, like with Nichols, her throat had been slashed with two deep cuts. But the mutilation in her case was even more extensive. Her abdomen was completely cut open, and the killer had taken sections of flesh from her stomach and intestines and placed them over her shoulders. And even more disturbingly, her uterus, sections of her bladder, and her vagina had all been removed.
And wasn't there an eyewitness in Chapman's case? Someone who saw her with a man shortly before she was killed?
Yeah. There was a woman named Elizabeth Long who said she saw Chapman talking to a man who she described as being kind of shabby genteel. He was wearing a deerstalker hat. And she said she overheard him ask Chapman, "Will you?" And Chapman replied, "Yes."
So it's not a very clear description, but it is something...
It is. It's a glimpse. It's not a positive identification, but it's a potential last contact that she had.
Right, right. And then you have that, what they call the double event, the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, which both happened on the same night, September 30th. I mean, just the thought of two murders happening so close together, it must have been just absolute terror in Whitechapel.
It must have been. I mean, can you imagine just this feeling of dread and fear that must have gripped the entire community?
Absolutely. So let's start with Elizabeth Stride. What do we know about her murder?
Elizabeth Stride's body was found in a yard off of Burner Street around 1 in the morning. She had a single, very clean cut across her neck, severed her carotid artery and trachea, and that's actually the main thing that sets her apart from the other canonical five. She didn't have any other mutilations.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and that's led some people to question whether she was actually a Ripper victim. The prevailing theory is that maybe the killer was interrupted, before he could do anything else.
Right, right. And like with Chapman, there were witnesses who reported seeing Stride with a man shortly before she was killed, weren't there?
Yeah, but unfortunately, the descriptions from those witnesses are pretty conflicting. Some said the man was fair-haired, others said he was dark-haired, some said he was shabbily dressed, while others said he was more well-dressed, so it's hard to know what to make of those accounts.
Okay. So it's really uncertain whether she was definitively a Ripper victim. And then, not long after Stride was found, Catherine Eddowes was murdered. I mean, that must have just sent shockwaves through the investigation, two murders in such a short time.
Absolutely. And Eddowes' murder was even more brutal, if you can believe it. She was found in Mitre Square, which was actually in the city of London, not technically Whitechapel, just a little over an hour after Stride's body was discovered. Her throat was cut from ear to ear, her abdomen was ripped open, her intestines were pulled out and placed over her shoulder. and a section of them was even detached. And on top of all that, her face was mutilated, her nose was severed, her cheek was slashed, there were cuts on her eyelids, triangular cuts on her cheeks, and they even found a piece of her ear at the scene.
That's just unimaginable.
It's horrific, and the police surgeon who examined her body, he estimated that those mutilations would have taken at least 5 minutes to carry out.
5 minutes. I mean, that's just a level of depravity that's hard
Yeah.
to comprehend. And there was a witness in Edo's case too, right?
Yeah. There was a man who said he saw Eddowes with a fair-haired man near Church Passage shortly before she was killed. But again, the description is pretty vague, and it's not clear if it was actually her with the man. And then, of course, there's the infamous piece of evidence that's linked to Eddowes, the bloody apron.
Right, right. The one that was found with the anti-Semitic graffiti.
Yeah. So a piece of Eddowes' apron covered in blood was found in Golston Street, and there was this chalk inscription written on the wall above it. It said, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." And that piece of graffiti has been incredibly controversial ever since it was discovered. Some people think it was written by the Ripper, maybe trying to blame Jewish people for the murders, but others think it was just, random graffiti that had nothing to do with the case. We'll never know for sure because the police commissioner at the time, he was so worried that it would incite anti-Semitic riots that he had it washed away before dawn.
Wow. So it was this really potent symbol of the anxieties and prejudices of the time.
Absolutely. And, sadly, those kinds of anxieties and prejudices haven't really gone away even all these years later.
It's true. And then the last of the canonical five, the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. I mean, that one was just horrific beyond words.
Yeah, Mary Jane Kelly was discovered in her room in Miller's Court on November 9th. And the level of mutilation in her case was it was described as beyond all recognition. Her face was just hacked to pieces. Her throat was slashed all the way to the spine, and her abdomen was almost completely emptied of its organs. Her uterus, kidneys, and one of her breasts were placed under her head. Other organs were scattered around the bed, and some sections of her abdomen and thighs were actually placed on a bedside table. Her heart was missing entirely.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's just an unimaginable scene. The brutality is it's beyond comprehension. And the article mentions that there was evidence that a fire had been lit in her room as well.
Yeah, what was that about?
So investigators found ashes in the fireplace, and they think that the killer probably burned some items in there, maybe clothes, maybe even furniture, to give himself light as he was mutilating her body. They even found a kettle that had been melted by the heat of the fire.
Wow. It just adds this whole other layer of horror to an already horrific scene.
It does.
So we've talked about the specifics of these five really awful murders. The article points out that there were some common threads, some patterns that kind of run through all of them. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so all of the canonical five murders, they all happened either late at night or really early in the morning. They all happened either on or very close to weekends. And they all tended to happen at the end of the month or about a week after the start of a new month.
Huh, that's interesting. It's almost like he was sticking to some kind of a schedule or something.
Yeah. And if you look at the pattern of the mutilations, they get progressively more severe as the murders go on. With the exception of Elizabeth Stride, which again, supports that theory that her attack might have been interrupted.
Right, right. And historically, these five are the ones that have been linked together consistently, in all these police documents and things.
Right. They show up together in reports by investigators like McNaughton and Bond, who are both very involved in the case. But it is important to remember that there's still debate about whether all five were definitively committed by the same person.
So even with all these patterns and, historical connections, there's still some uncertainty.
There is. Some researchers think that, while one person was probably responsible for at least some of the five, others might have been copycats or even just completely unrelated murders. They might have been lured in with the Ripper case just because of the timing and the general atmosphere of fear that was hanging over Whitechapel.
Yeah, it would make sense that something like this, with all the attention it was getting, might inspire other people to commit similar crimes.
Right. And there were some contemporary figures, even some of the police investigators, who only definitively linked three of the murders together, suggesting that copycat killings might have been a factor.
Okay, so beyond those canonical five, the article mentions some other murders that happened later in Whitechapel. Can you tell me a little bit about those and how they fit into the bigger picture?
Yeah, so those later murders, they raise this whole question of when and why the Ripper's activities might have ended. Did he die? Was he in prison for something else? Did he just stop killing? We don't really know.
Yeah, it's like the trail just goes cold.
It does. So the later murders that the police were looking at included Rose Mylett, who was strangled in December of 1888. There was Alice Mackenzie, who was stabbed in July of 1889. Then there was this really gruesome discovery of the Pinchin Street torso in September 1889. That was a headless, legless, and really badly mutilated torso. And then finally, there's Frances Coles, who had her throat cut in February of 1891.
Wow. So those murders continued for quite a while after the canonical five.
They did. And there's been a lot of debate about whether any of those later murders can be linked to Jack the Ripper. With Rose Mylett, some people thought her death might have been accidental. Alice Mackenzie's wounds led some investigators, including Dr. Bond, to think that it could have been the Ripper, but others thought it was more likely a copycat. The Pinchin Street torso is often linked to a separate, unidentified torso killer just because the MO was so different. And with Francis Coles, they actually arrested a suspect who they thought might be the Ripper, but he was eventually released because they didn't have enough evidence.
Okay, so it's really unclear whether any of those later killings can be definitively tied to the Ripper.
It is. It's all very much speculation. And then on top of all those, the article lists a whole bunch of other alleged victims, some of whom were killed even before the canonical five.
Yeah, there were a lot of names in that list.
Mm.
Are any of those considered to be likely victims of the Ripper?
Most of them are considered to be pretty unlikely or even just outright myths. There's one, Fairy Faye, that a lot of people think was just a fabrication, something that came out of all the confused reporting around the murder of Emma Elizabeth Smith. There were also a couple of women, Annie Millwood and Ada Wilson, who were attacked in early 1888. Millwood was killed and Wilson survived. And some people think those attacks might have been early Ripper murders, but there's not really any solid evidence to support that.
Okay, so really, it seems like the focus remains on those canonical five.
It does. It really all comes back to that very specific and really horrific way in which those five women were killed.
All right, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the investigation itself. I mean, it sounds like it was a monumental task for the Victorian police force, trying to solve these murders in the middle of this, overcrowded and chaotic city.
It was, and unfortunately, a lot of the original police records were destroyed during the Blitz in World War II, so we don't have as complete a picture of the investigation as we'd like to.
Oh, that's a shame.
It is, but thankfully, we do have some surviving records from the Metropolitan Police. And those give us at least some insight into how they were approaching the case. They did a lot of house-to-house inquiries, they tried to collect forensic evidence, and they interviewed thousands of people.
Thousands of people.
Over 2,000, and they ended up investigating hundreds of potential suspects.
Wow. So this was a massive undertaking, especially for the time period. And the article names some of the key investigators who were involved in the case. Can you tell me a little bit about them?
Sure. So initially, the investigation in Whitechapel was being led by a guy named Edmund Reed. He was a detective inspector. But then, as the murders continued and they got more and more attention, the police brought in some more experienced investigators from Scotland Yard to help out. That included Frederick Aberline, Henry Moore, and Walter Andrews. And then, after Catherine Eddowes was murdered in the city of London, a detective inspector named James McWilliam got involved from that police force.
So you've got all these different investigators from different departments working on this case. It must have been a real challenge to coordinate everything.
It was, and the overall coordination fell to Chief Inspector Donald Swanson from Scotland Yard. He basically had to oversee the whole thing, especially since the head of CID was actually on leave during a lot of the time when the key murders were happening.
Oh, wow. So Swanson really had his work cut out for him.
He did. And of course, because of the nature of the murders, with all the mutilations, a lot of the early suspicion fell on people who worked in certain professions, people who might have had some knowledge of anatomy.
Right. People like butchers or surgeons.
Exactly. But the article mentions that the police actually did a pretty thorough job of investigating the local butchers and slaughterers, and they eventually ruled them out as suspects.
Interesting. So they were really trying to cover all their bases.
They were. They even looked into this theory that the killer might have been a sailor who came in on one of the cattle boats that came from mainland Europe. That seemed plausible at first, because the docks were right there in Whitechapel. But when they looked into the shipping schedules, they couldn't really make the dates line up.
So that theory didn't really pan out.
It didn't. And as the investigation dragged on and the killer remained at large, people started getting really frustrated. They felt like the police weren't doing enough to catch him. And that frustration and fear led to the formation of this group called the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee.
Right. Tell me about that.
It was basically a group of local citizens who decided to take matters into their own hands. They were fed up with the lack of progress in the investigation, so they started patrolling the streets themselves. They were looking for anyone suspicious, anyone who might fit the description of the killer. They even put up their own reward money and hired private detectives.
Wow. So they were basically like a neighborhood watch group, but on a much bigger and more organized scale.
Right. They were just regular people who were terrified for their community, and they felt like they had to do something to protect themselves.
Yeah. I can't even imagine how unsettling it must have been to live in Whitechapel during that time, knowing that this killer was still out there.
It must have been absolutely terrifying. And it's interesting because the article mentions something that seems really modern, considering this was happening in the late 1800s, the beginnings of criminal profiling.
Oh, right, right. Tell me about that. How did that come about?
So one of the police surgeons, a guy named Dr. Thomas Bond, he was really involved in examining the bodies of the victims. And in late October of 1888, he wrote up this report where he basically tried to create a profile of the killer based on the evidence that they had.
So he was looking at the patterns in the murders, the way the victims were killed, and trying to draw some conclusions about the kind of person who might be responsible.
Exactly. And this is considered to be one of the earliest examples of criminal profiling. And it was actually pretty insightful for the time.
Okay, so what kind of profile did he come up with?
Well, he looked at all 5 of the canonical murders, and he concluded that they were all very likely committed by the same person. He thought that the killer was probably a man, and that he was probably acting alone. He also believed that the victims' throats were cut while they were lying down. And he didn't think that the killer had any special anatomical knowledge, like a surgeon or a butcher might
Huh.
have.
Interesting. So he didn't think he was someone with medical training.
He didn't. He thought it was more likely someone who was just, very strong and very brutal. And he also had some thoughts about the killer's psychological state. He said he thought the killer was prone to what he called periodical attacks of homicidal and erotic mania. He even suggested that the killer might have a condition called satyriasis, which is basically, an excessive sex drive. And he had thought that the mutilations, they might have been the killer's way of achieving sexual gratification.
So this was really groundbreaking stuff for the time.
It was. I mean, Bond was really trying to get inside the head of the killer, which was a pretty novel approach back then.
And of course, despite all these efforts, the investigation ultimately failed to identify Jack the Ripper. The article then goes on to talk about all these different suspects that have been proposed over the years, and it seems like there's no shortage of theories out there.
Oh, no shortage at all. There's a whole field of study dedicated to it. Ripperology.
Ripperology. Wow.
It's fascinating and frustrating because there's just so much we don't know and probably never will.
Yeah. So what are some of the main theories about who Jack the Ripper might have been?
Well, because the murders were all concentrated in this pretty small area, a lot of people thought that the killer must have been a local. Someone who lived and worked in Whitechapel, maybe someone who knew the streets and the victims.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It would give him a certain level of familiarity with the area.
Yeah.
Make it easier for him to move around undetected.
Exactly. But then there are these other theories that suggest the killer might have been someone from a higher social class, maybe even an aristocrat. Those theories often tap into these anxieties about class and power that were really prevalent in Victorian society.
Right, right. Like the idea that someone from the upper classes could be preying on the poor and vulnerable.
Exactly. And the article mentions that a lot of these theories, especially the ones that have come up in recent years, they tend to rely on pretty flimsy evidence.
Yeah. I mean, with everyone from that era long gone, it's easy to point fingers about having to worry about, being contradicted.
Right. And even a lot of the suspects who were actually named in police documents back then, they only had circumstantial evidence against them at best. And modern attempts to identify the Ripper, like through DNA analysis, they haven't really been conclusive either.
Okay. Tell me about those.
Well, there's a real lack of reliable forensic evidence from the crime scenes, which is a huge obstacle. And there have been these attempts to analyze DNA from, clothing and letters that have been linked to some of the main suspects. But those attempts, they've been really controversial, and results haven't been widely accepted by the scientific community.
So it seems like we're no closer to knowing for sure who Jack the Ripper was.
I don't think we are. It's a mystery that may never be solved. And then, of course, you have the letters. The letters that were supposedly written by the killer, Those have become just a huge part of the whole Jack the Ripper story.
Yeah. Those letters are just creepy. And they really added to the whole atmosphere of fear at the time.
They did. The police and the media received hundreds of letters during the investigation, but most of them were just hoaxes or, useless rambling. But there are three that really stand out: the Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, and the From Hell letter. Those are the ones that have really captured people's imaginations.
And the Dear Boss letter is where the name Jack the Ripper first appeared.
Right. And it got a lot of